How's it going, everybody? I am ZBilbs and I'm back here with another video. And today, it's been a little while since I've done a games versus video, but I thought now that the Dead Space remake has been out for a little while, this is absolutely a great time to be doing a versus between the Dead Space remake and the Resident Evil 2 remake, both of which has been absolutely landmark, greatly received horror game remakes that have come out in the last handful of years. So I'm just going to go over a couple categories, compare and contrast the two games, and overall give my opinion of which remake I thought was better. With that out of the way, I also like to say I think both of these are absolutely great games, and you haven't gone out and played them yet, you absolutely should. If you're a fan of horror games or just good games in general, play them both. Yeah, without further ado, I'm just going to get into the first category, and that is going to be the aesthetic and style of these games. Now, both of these games are absolutely drop-dead gorgeous. The Dead Space, for one, really captures that, the feel, the cosmic horror of space, whether you're in space itself or whether you're in the Ishimura ship. Just the lighting is fantastic, the darkness, the sci-fi aesthetic, everything absolutely great. And honestly, same thing for Resident Evil 2 remake. It still looks absolutely great. I know it only came out like 2-3 years ago, but same thing. It captures, well, I was going to say the original style. I also like to note I haven't played the original for either of those games, so I'm purely comparing them as games themselves and not how faithful to their source materials. But either way, I think both of these games are absolutely great looking, and I don't think I can choose a winner for this one. There isn't one where I'm like, yeah, that's like definitively better looking. So yeah, this is a tie for aesthetic and style. They're both great looking games. I think it kind of just comes down to personal preference of whether you like the art style of one or the other. So that's 1-1 after this round. Moving into the second round, let's compare the stories of both. So Resident Evil 2, the story, Leon and Claire, they're going to Raccoon City, they get separated, and then they're just, going places, meeting people, trying to escape the city, essentially. Which, it's good, it does its job, there's some interesting moments in the story, but the story is not the chief factor of this game, and that obviously is just the gameplay. For Dead Space, while the gameplay is obviously the biggest factor as well, the story is much more central to the game in general. The character and the characters, there's a lot more dialogue going on in this game than the Resident Evil 2 remake. It's more of a mystery where you have to go and sort of piece together all the little mysteries and details, and there's a lot of really interesting twists and turns in there. But yeah, I'm not going to linger on this one any longer because I think it's pretty obvious that Dead Space remake is head and shoulders above Resident Evil 2 remake when it comes to its story. So I'm giving this round to the Dead Space remake, so that is 2-1 after round 2. All right, next up, let's talk about the atmosphere of these two games. Now, with every horror game, the environment, the surroundings and the feel that the game creates for the player is absolutely huge to how good a horror game is, and the atmosphere in both of these games is absolutely excellent. Starting with Dead Space, just the cosmic horror feel, all the little just sounds and vibrations that happen, all the random little events, cause just so much just unease and tension. The necromorphs, just you never know when one is gonna appear. Obviously the art style builds to this atmosphere so well, builds this cosmic horror and this space vibe. So Dead Space does this absolutely excellently, but so does Resident Evil 2 remake, where this builds, tension so great. Then whenever you're out of a safe room, you constantly feel unsafe, when you feel so helpless, you have such a lack of guns and ammo, and it's dark in every corridor, and there's zombies. You can either shoot them or you can escape from them. Once Mr. X gets introduced, that builds the tension and the atmosphere even more. And it's there's also a diversity in the atmosphere here that I think the Dead Space lacks a little bit, where that's all just sort of this cosmic space vibe. Here you've got the police station, then you get a little more of the dank, dark, gross vibe of the sewers, and then a little bit more of the sci-fi vibe once you get into the lab. So the atmosphere that both of these two games create is both so excellent that, once again, just like the aesthetic, I don't think there's a clear winner here. So I'm going to give the atmosphere of these two games a tie. All right, moving on to the weapons and combat for these two games. Starting with Resident Evil 2 Remake, like the combat is really solid. I love the diversity that whether you pick Leon or Claire, you get access to a different set of weapons, and it makes repeat playthroughs really interesting and satisfying. Unlocking the different gun upgrades encourages exploring even more, and it can be really satisfying, timing those perfect headshots and all of the zombies. So overall combat is really solid, really interesting. But to be honest, Dead Space Remake combat is absolutely the name of the game in that in that game. There are, I think, very few other games that have done combat in such a unique style, having seven different guns that are straight out of a science fiction novel. I don't think I've seen guns quite as unique as the plasma cutter, pulse rifle, flamethrower, the gravity cannon. Every single weapon feels so unique and so interesting and incredibly fun to use. And because I think Dead Space is definitely more action-oriented than Resident Evil 2 Remake, it should have had better combat, which it did, I think. So I think this is pretty easily going for Dead Space. Now, with a good combat system, you gotta have interesting things to use that combat against. And so next up, let's talk about the enemies and bosses in these games. So for Resident Evil 2 Remake, obviously the main enemies you're gonna fight are gonna be zombies, which are very interesting to fight, very fun, trying to aim those headshots perfectly. Mr. X, when he shows up, he's such an interesting threat, just running away from him. So unique, so cool. There's a handful of other, obviously, iconic enemies in the Lickers, in the Ivies. Bosses, obviously, you got the different G phase like 1, 2, and 3. There's a super tyrant. So a lot of really interesting bosses too. Now what I'll say about Resident Evil 2 Remake is that because it's a little bit less action oriented, and it can be a little bit harder to maneuver on some of these boss fights, it makes some of them a little bit tedious. I'm talking about like the G boss fight phase 2, the super tyrant boss fight. When you have like that super tight corridor, it gets a little janky. And so while mostly it's all pretty good, it can be a little tedious at times. Also, while the enemies themselves are good, there's probably a little bit of a lack of enemy variety there as well. Moving over to Dead Space, this game obviously I think has superior combat. And also it has, I'd say, superior in most cases for enemies and bosses as well. The necromorphs are just super unique, interesting enemies that I don't think any other game has done anything like it, where instead of going for headshots, you gotta shoot their limbs off, which makes just enemies super interesting to fight. There's also a really solid variety of enemies as well. I think I encountered like at least it had to have been like 10 plus different variations, which made you had to adapt to what enemy you're facing as to what gun you're going to use or how you're going to fight them. Um, as for bosses, bosses are also super interesting, especially the giant one that's kind of like a big, butthole monster that you have to fight like twice. And especially the one in space, that one was so cool. I love having to use like your telekinetic powers with your stasis powers and your guns. Those all get used really well, especially in the boss fights. The final boss fight, I think it goes on a little bit too long, but it's also really good. Now, honestly, I'd say in every case, pretty much, maybe because it's a little bit more combat oriented, but also because there's just more variety and more uniqueness. Dead Space, I think, is also the clear winner for the enemies and bosses. I considered making this one a tie just because I think Mr. X is such a unique and interesting enemy, but really Mr. X, I think, is the one exception to Resident Evil 2 Remake. Where I say overall enemies and bosses, it's still definitely Dead Space. So I'm giving another point to Dead Space. All right, this next category, I'm going to give 2 points for the winner on this one because this is probably maybe the most important thing on video games like these, probably second most, and that is the level design. Now, you can make a game with super great enemies and combat and stuff, but if it's uninteresting, the locations that you are and the ways that you progress through the game, then it doesn't make for a good game. So what is absolutely huge is how you design your levels. How is it implemented that you get from point A to B in the order that you fight and the situations that you fight. So going over for Resident Evil 2 Remake, the level design is absolutely immaculate in my opinion. Starting off with the police station, which is probably the highlight of the game, just the non-linear way that you approach the game and the way that it's structured with the different safe rooms and having you to venture through zombie infested hallways and find supplies and just explore and just figure out where to go, and then leaving that area and having to come back with the addition of Mr. X after you have familiar with it just is such a genius way of adding to this original level where you're starting to figure out things, but then you've this added tension of Mr. X always being behind you, that it just makes traversal that much more interesting. After that, the sewers are also incredibly interesting just by aesthetic alone. They're a little bit more difficult to traverse, but they're just about as tense with those giant, like, weird tentacle monsters. The lab is also interesting, probably the least interesting area, but just like the other ways, just the kind of open-ended traversal, the discovering new areas, having to solve the puzzles, and having to creatively navigate the enemies, using your inventory. I think the level design in Resident Evil 2 Remake overall is absolutely spectacular. Moving on to Dead Space, this game, for one, it's a lot more linear than Resident Evil 2 Remake is. Apparently, it's less linear than the original Dead Space was, I've heard. Apparently, you couldn't go back and forth in between the cabins in the original Dead Space, so I do like the addition of being able to do that. That being said, except for like a couple missions where you'll have to return to some areas that you had already been, for the most part, when you go to an area, you kind of go from room to room, you fight some enemies, and then you leave that area, you go to the next area, you go room to room, you fight some enemies, you do some things. The only real reason to return to areas for the most part is if you want to, find some goodies that were locked before that you couldn't get to. So overall, the levels, while, the stuff that you do in these areas are fun, there's some decent variety. Obviously, the combat and the bosses you'll fight are great. The zero gravity jetpack areas are also great. I find it a little bit less interesting and unique. I like that open-ended style a little more. I think it works even more in a horror setting when you're having to go back and forth and retrace your steps, knowing that there's enemies there that you're still going to have to deal with. Then it is when you're going kind of in a straight line, you take down the enemies, you keep going, you take down some more enemies. Obviously, you might have to backtrack, but it's usually your own choice. So while I'd say it still works pretty well in the game, I definitely prefer the style of Resident Evil 2. So I'm going to give these points for level design to Resident Evil 2 Remake. And lastly, I said level design may be the most important. This one's probably the most important, because when it comes to a horror game, what is the most important thing? It's absolutely the scariness of the game. Now, atmosphere obviously contributes to scariness of the game, but it's not the only factor of like what makes a game scary. Because you know the environment and the tension that it builds to the player is a big deal, but other things are a huge factor, like you know, the enemies you'll fight, the inventory management you might face, the type of combat that you'll have to deal with, the type of way that the levels are designed to make you progress through the game, all build to the scariness of a horror game. Now, overall, while I would say each game has equally terrifying enemies and atmosphere and environments, the reason why I think that I would say Resident Evil 2 Remake was a lot scarier for me was just having less of an emphasis on the combat than Dead Space Remake. And Dead Space, obviously it should have had good combat, like that's what it was going for, but the way that it structured the combat and the way that it structured the more linear levels, as I've already mentioned, it took away from the scariness to me, because when you're going in through Dead Space, for the most part, you know, you're walking through an area, you really don't have to worry about inventory management. I don't think I ever ran out of ammo, and even when you do, it's pretty easy to do your kinesis to just skewer guys, so the combat is super fun, and it's absolutely great. But, you know, I would go through an area, I'd go through a room, I'd take out all of the enemies, I'd go on to the next area, take out all the enemies. Really, all I had to do was just, you know, go to an area, take out the enemies, go to area, take out the enemies, and eventually it became a little routine where the scariness from the game, it came less from, you know, kind of being out of my depth and being like, oh man, I could run out of ammo and I could have to just, you know, the fear of the unknown a little bit got taken out when it was like, you know, just essentially became a scary third-person shooter. Whereas Resident Evil 2 Remake, you know, obviously having the scary atmosphere and the scary enemies in conjunction with, I think, both the level design and the inventory management absolutely makes this game way scarier. Going like and adventuring away from the safe rooms, not knowing if you're gonna have enough bullets to take out all the zombies in your way, and probably potentially you have to dodge and weave past zombies, knowing that you may have to come back that way and avoid getting attacked again, is for me a lot scarier than going through, you know, one set path view and knowing, okay, I'm gonna be able to take out all these enemies, just how well am I going to be able to do that? And then obviously the open-ended design, having to return to all of these areas where you may or may not have taken out these enemies, and probably the biggest factor is Mr. X, who adds a whole other layer on top of the already scary factor to the game, you know, him chasing you down, even in areas where you might have taken out all of the zombies. You know, only in safe rooms are you safe from him. While there was a couple of like hunter enemies in Dead Space that you couldn't, you know, you couldn't kill, they were few and far between, and they couldn't track you down through the entire ship, only through a couple rooms here and there. So they definitely paled in comparison to bringing the scares than Resident Evil 2. So overall, all those things combined, I absolutely, while Dead Space was scary, it definitely, I think Resident Evil 2 is the scarier game between the two. All right, and after that, looking at the final scores between these two games, I have Dead Space at 5 points and Resident Evil 2 at 6 points. Both of these are obviously great games. This is incredibly close, but I think that Resident Evil 2 Remake was a little bit better than the Dead Space remake. And for the reasons that I mentioned, I think the biggest factors was absolutely the level design was more interesting, and it created obviously a scarier game overall, which I think is the most important thing when it comes to a horror game. Dead Space is great on its own, I think, as a really fun third person shooter with good horror elements in it. It absolutely succeeds big time. But if you want a game that is both, interesting and scary to play, and, it is probably gonna give you a little bit more tension, I would definitely go with Resident Evil 2 Remake. But, if more like action oriented game is your thing, then it's Dead Space. So, as I said, they're both worth checking out, but for my money, I prefer Resident Evil 2 by a bit. So that is all I got for you for this video. Let me know in the comments which of these remakes do you think was better. Let me know if there's any other games that you'd like me to do versus in the future. I might compare Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 4 Remake when that one comes out. But yeah, that is all I've got for you today, so I will see you later.